have our What's Up at ESD, Environmental Services Division, that we have a rain barrel sale going on, and the rain barrel can also work as a laptop holder. But our rain barrels, so there's little slips on that going on. We've been doing webinars. We did a rain barrel one, a compost one, assorted ones, and they're all archived on our website, and more are coming up. Like next Tuesday at noon is one on trees, the importance of trees related to water. So those have all been going on since February, and will continue the rest of the year. And then we have a little blog, and there will be a business webinar series coming up too for businesses of how they can prevent pollution. But for tonight, the theme is native plants, that it's finally getting into garden mode. As the snow took a while to melt away, and we have plenty of water out there. But as the temperatures go up, it's good to get in our gardens, and we have some really good gardeners here, and people with a lot of experience working with plants, and native plants are definitely an important topic. So for tonight, Terry's on the lights, I really can't see. First speaker, first presenter tonight is Carol Andrews, and she's with the Arrowhead Wild Ones group, and their display is back here. She's also with Bar Engineering, and she's a stormwater engineer. She's refers to herself as a biologist trapped in an engineer's body. But she's worked a lot with native plants and has worked with down in the Twin Cities with a landscaping firm, and just a lot of hands-on. She also, I know, was very involved with the rain garden outside of UMD, big scale rain garden project. But she's here to talk about native plants and some of the many benefits which are also relating to our insect critters. So let's welcome Carol.
Thanks, Wendy. Well, thanks, Wendy, for setting this up and for inviting Wild Ones to participate. We really appreciate the opportunity to get out and talk to people. Wild Ones is a national nonprofit that has a very limited focus, and that focus is promoting the use of more native plants, especially in home, school, and business landscapes. And we're one of 50 chapters across the country, and it's really a nice educational group that tries to reach people at all levels. And what I'm going to talk about today is native plants. Since I'm the first presenter, I said I would talk about, make sure we're all on the same page with what do we talk about when we use the term native plants. Maybe everybody here is familiar with it, but in case not, cover some of the real basics and the benefits of landscaping with native plants, how to get started and other hints, and then a few examples of native plant landscapes, some yards to help you picture what it might look like. And then I want to make sure I have about 5 minutes at the end to talk about a really exciting new Wild Ones project called Wild for Monarchs. So native plants are the trees, shrubs, vines, and other herbaceous plants that existed here before European settlement, before somebody wrote back east or back to Europe and said, oh, I so missed my dandelion greens, my liver is bothering me, please send dandelion seeds. And that was the start of people bringing along the plants they were used to, the plants they had uses for many of them was the driver as much as ornamental, had uses and things, but then a lot of those escape and have become naturalized. So we don't call them native plants. I still call those wildflowers, but not native wildflowers. And they vary from place to place. They're not weeds. Any plant out of place is a weed. I have friends who will say, oh, do you have weed club this Wednesday? It's Wild Ones, thank you very much. They're sometimes not as stationary and unchanging as horticultural cultivars. I give this presentation a lot to garden clubs, some of whom have been gardening for 40, 50, 60 years with beautiful perennial gardens that don't change a lot from year to year. The peonies stay here. I won't say daylilies because those spread, but a lot of the plants that they're used to stay in place. Native plants have a will of their own at times when you're trying to landscape with them, and if you relax and go with it, it can be a lot of fun. You can get a lot of free plants as they reseed around your yard. And another thing that comes up is the term cultivar. If somebody in the horticultural trade takes a native plant and through selection or crossbreeding makes something that, you end up with something that's a semi-native plant. And an example I use a lot is for black-eyed Susans, which is a true native. there's a plant that's used a lot called Rudbeckia goldsturm, and if it has that single quotation marks about it, around it when you buy it at the store, that indicates it's a cultivar. They look beautiful, they often have some benefits, again, like the goldsturm doesn't move, and it'll bloom every year, it's not a biennial, and it doesn't just seed all over like the true native. So they're often more convenient if you want that sort of convenience. They typically are said to not have as many wildlife benefits as the true natives. So if you're really doing this, if you're getting into landscaping with natives for wildlife benefit, you want to look for true native plants. And I'll talk at the end, I'll mention some places to buy them, and we'll have one of the main sellers is going to be here. When we talk about native plants, they're specific, of course, to certain areas, but instead of the hardiness zones, we talk about ecoregions. So it's different than the hardiness zone maps, although climate is one of the characteristics that affects it. But in addition to climate, you have characteristics such as soils and other things that have impacted what's native in a particular place. And in Minnesota, we have actually 4 ecoregions. Before I lived in Duluth, I thought it was 3. I have to admit, I was Twin City centric and thought prairie, mixed hardwoods, conifer. But we have the Great Lakes ecosystem. And I'm sorry I don't have the same thing for Wisconsin, but I know the Great Lakes ecosystem, just like our climate, hugs the lake all the way around the lake. And so there's certain plants, some spread across all these regions, but they tend to group themselves by the regions. And so you want to keep that in mind when you're thinking, what am I going to plant? You don't want to look at, oh, I grew up in maybe Marshall, Minnesota, and we had a prairie in the backyard, let's plant what grew there. It's better to, when you say native, you're trying to grow what originally was growing here to benefit the animals and wildlife that was here. So some of the benefits of native plants, for one thing, runoff and stormwater have become major environmental issues. The more we pave the planet, basically, the more we're concentrating runoff. And lawns, I have a picture in a while, do absorb some moisture, but not nearly as much as deep-rooted vegetation. And trees, as the presenter, it's neat, you're going to present her in a week or two on the benefit of trees for stormwater, the interception and the transpiration that those provide. Some lawn, I play soccer, I have kids, you know, having some grass is a great surface to play on and things like that. But sometimes it becomes like the default. Well, I don't know what else to do, and I bought 4 acres, and then maybe it was corn, so people put it all in lawn. They're just not sure what else to do. But I think sometimes it gets a bit excessive. Now, just so I don't sound like too much of a, the world must be all native plants. One thing I always point out, like I said, you know, lawn has its place. There's, as far as non-natives go, as long as they are not invasive exotics like the buckthorn, like the European honeysuckle, you know, everybody probably in your yard, tansy, whatever it is that is taking over, that's hard to control, that's in our wilderness areas. I live by Chester Park in Duluth, and the European honeysuckle there is really taking over, and a lot of buckthorn, and it displaces the native plants. So we are opposed to invasive exotic plants, but if you want to mix in this case it's an example of a friend of mine when he first started his rain garden, he, for economic reasons and other things, he planted the native plants spaced out and knowing that they would spread and reseed over time, but he said it looked kind of scrawny, and his neighbor's been saying, what are you doing tearing up your lawn for a couple of weeks? And he wanted to make a nice impression, so he threw in, you know, he invested $30 in annuals at the June sale or whatever, threw those in. There's no law against that. You can do whatever you want. You can have peonies and natives all together. So just so we don't sound like if you do anything other than plant a native restoration that it's not okay. If you want to do that, that is great, but you don't have to. Other benefits of landscaping with native plants is just creating more natural areas for children to play in. There's a whole books on nature deficit disorder and how kids these days, what makes me sound really old, but don't tend to spend as much time just doing what kids do, playing with sticks, digging in the dirt, seeing what they find, and then also just promoting a closer personal relationship with the natural world and uniqueness of where we live. If you think about a landscape that has a house and a couple of pruned arborvitaes and maybe a big maple tree and a bunch of grass, and, you know, some impatiens under the tree. Do you know if you're in Duluth or Des Moines or Dallas? It kind of is the generic Walmart of landscaping, whereas a lot of people live in this area because of the natural beauty. And they like to go to Gooseberry, they like to go to Jay Cook to see that. Well, why not have some of that in your own yard? And the bird watching. I live on a small urban lot, and when I got home today, there were so many different birds in the yard. Of course, a lot of them, they were going for the feeder, but from that feeder, they're going into the bushes on the front yard and things like that, the other things that they need for habitat. As we mentioned, from a water standpoint, and since the Superior is sponsoring this, apart from a water management, I want to point out rain gardens and natives go together. There's so many native plants that really thrive in wet conditions, so the two of those work well together. Now this slide is especially applicable for talking about prairies, but you can grow some of these plants here. They're, you know, what I'm talking about is mostly naturally would be forested areas, but there are meadow openings. And many native plants have extremely deep roots. When I first learned about native plants, maybe I'm a geek, but I thought this was fascinating. So this is an image of Kentucky bluegrass. And compared to that, the depth of some of these roots for the native plants, the big blue stem, which does grow naturally up in this area, prairie dropseed can be over 7 or 8 feet deep into the soil. And that's also part of why the prairies of western Minnesota had such amazing soil when they were churned up for agricultural uses, is all that, those roots, if about a third of them die off every year, it's like inserting compost into the soil. And I will say, in the planting I've done, I have some really sunny areas where I've used things like stiff goldenrod and so on, and even planting them in clay, they get their roots down into the clay. They have very aggressive root structure. And then the main thing that I guess is probably why I think planting natives is most important is habitat. Again, just sort of trying to be landscape and live a little bit more in tune with nature and appreciating nature. When it comes into your yard, I think you're more apt to be in tune with it such that you want to preserve it in other places as well. And so I'm going to expand a little bit more about habitat or landscaping for wildlife, another way of putting it. So what wildlife needs, I think most of us cover this in 8th grade, maybe earlier. Food, shelter, water, and safe places to raise your young. What do wild native plants provide? Food, shelter, water, and safe places to raise your young. They go together. Another connection that I used to think when I first started landscaping with native plants is that I'm very interested in birds, and so to attract birds, I planted a lot of trees that had seeds, nuts, and especially berries, like juneberry, and I used to have a lot of chokeberry and things like that that provide that part of the food chain for birds. But one thing that I've learned since then is that birds don't survive on fruits and berries year round. What they need is just like when, especially certain times of year when they're producing eggs and rearing their young, they need insects, they need protein. So the insects though, what attracts insects? Native plants. They go together. There's a lot of insects such as monarchs that have a particular plant that they live on. Only a few insects are generalists, like grasshoppers that'll eat anything in their path. There's large numbers that need specific plants, and they need the plants that they historically grew up with, and those are the native plants to this area. There's a professor who lives in Delaware, Dr. Doug Tallamy, who has a book called Bringing Nature Home. Has anybody read that book or familiar with it? It's first, his background, instead of being a landscaper, his background is in insect studying. What do you call that? Entomology, thank you. He's an entomologist, and he does a lot of research. He does research where he bought a plot of land, and it was a large suburban plot, acre or two, and it had lots and lots of lawn. He proceeded over about a 10-year period to get rid of most of the lawn, planted with trees, shrubs, and so on, that were native to the area. he was surrounded by neighbors that had the traditional suburban lawn, and then he gets his master's students, because what are master's students for if not to count insects in your yard? And they actually went and they did comparison studies of the 2 yards, of the insect species present and then the bird species present. And just in that little tiny microcosm, the difference was huge. And he's taken that and realized, looking at things such as the pollinator, that we're losing a lot of our pollinators that we need to pollinate the crops, if nothing else, that we eat. If we look at it just from a self-serving standpoint, that we are running out of habitat to the point that it's we're at risk of actually having like a collapse of our systems. So again, in case I'm not saying this right, the plants and animals that evolved in North America are depending more and more on our human landscapes. There's so much that's been moved from natural into agricultural or urban development that there's just not that much nature left. One of his figures, and I think this is 10 years old now, is we have 40 million acres of lawn in the United States. That's the size of Missouri. If we could convert half of that into habitat, it would be a huge benefit. His saying is we've taken 95% of quote-unquote nature and made it unnatural. We can't keep living like the only species on the planet because it's the other species that create services essential to our own survival. So if the whole thing about attracting birds to your yard doesn't motivate you to plant some native plants, their survival of the human species can be motivating for some people, not others. I don't know. So I'm going to move ahead. Just a few things on the how-to. And actually, I should check. So for the people here, I have about 8 slides on, okay, say you decide to start landscaping with native plants, how do I go about it? Is that of use, or should I go to the Monarch project? So raise your hand if you're interested in the how-to slides. Okay, we'll run through those. I'm just trying to make sure we don't take up too much of that early time. So the first thing is making a plan, and you want to start with a base map where you look at what already exists in your yard. This is not my yard. I do not actually have a pool and a creek, but it's a nice example I took from a book. But so you start with your base map of what you have, and then add a bubble diagram. So the bubble diagram is where you might look at how do you use the areas of the yard. So this is my play area. This is where I dry the laundry. This is where we barbecue, things like that, picnic tables. Just brainstorm on how you want to use the yard. And then after you've done that, actually I'm gonna go back. So you might end up drawing bubbles such that you end up with a few areas like, okay, here we don't have any anthropogenic uses for the yard that preclude having trees, or maybe you say, oh, okay, over here I want a contemplative, quiet place with a bench to read. Well, that would be an awesome place to put up some shrubs to shield the view of your neighbor's house and invite birds around while you're reading, things like that. So that's just going through the planning. And this is a do as I say, not as I do, but how many people do this? You go to a plant sale, or you go out to Paul Helena's, and you just get all enthused about the plants that are there. You take them home, and then you decide where you're going to put them, which is fine. I've developed most of my yard that way. But if you have a plan, it does help you in 10 years not be ripping out what you don't want anymore. Some ideas for adding native plants if you don't want to do the whole plan or as you're thinking of it. Hedges. Hedges planted with native shrubs is about the easiest thing you can do. And sticking to trees and shrubs if you don't want plants that you're going to have to worry about, oh, is this a weed or is this a plant? Trees and shrubs, you can pretty much tell, I planted that. Everything around it, you can just mulch it, or you know it's a weed, and so on. Shrub mounds, what I mean by that is basically instead of shrubs in a row, shrubs in a circle in a mound. But those, from a habitat standpoint, the wildlife, birds tend to like having a dense area where they can try to get away from predators. Of course, if you have the room and the time and the budget to do a full-scale restoration, that's great. This example, I don't know if it works real well. Unfortunately, it doesn't show their house, but you can see it's a very typical suburban yard or suburban area. And what they did was a border about 8 feet wide all the way around. They left the grass in the middle so it looks enough like the other yards, but they've really got a lot of native plants in that. This example, instead of mowing under here, there's a nice shady area where they have some thimbleberry and other shade-loving plants. Rain gardens we mentioned. This is the opposite of the border. In this case, they have a large area, about 30 by 15, that they put in a native prairie, and this was down in Illinois. I stayed with them when I was there for a meeting. And they have a huge yard, but this, they said, we want to see it from our living room. So that's the other thing, is think about, where do you sit most often in the house, and try to position things where you can appreciate them. This is down in new development near Chicago. They did a ton of native landscaping. I don't know if they have any lawn. And it drains down to a wetland in the middle. This is my yard. I live on a steep hillside. So when we moved in, mowing this is kind of crazy, and I thought, what am I going to do? Play, croquet out here? It doesn't really work for that. So for me, with our small yard, the steep front hillside made as much sense as anything. It also keeps my kids from sliding on it into the street.
Could I ask you?
Yeah.
Go back to that slide. What is that plant on your right?
So this is the black-eyed Susans. Here's a close-up. This is blue vervain. I like yellow and purple together, and I swear it has nothing to do with football teams. Do not kick me out. One of the things, when you're selecting specific plants, there's the usual things you think about no matter what you're planting: sun, soil, moisture, size, and appearance. But aggressiveness is one thing I always sort of warn people to keep in mind. Do you want the plant to spread? You may want to. My neighbor the other day said, you know what, I want to get rid of my boulevard. So I was suggesting plant something really aggressive that'll just fill in. But in other cases, you might not want it to. This one on the right, we planted at our community garden at Leif Erikson Park, and it's kind of one of those things you regret now. It's really taken over. It looks beautiful, but it's out competing the other things, whereas the prairie smoke and the thimbleflower, which is anemone cylinderca versus anemone canadensis, same genus, different species. One stays put, one moves. So just making sure you ask when you're buying plants. This is my other example. Unfortunately, there's a deck here now. But I put this sweetgrass in clumps because I thought, oh, that'd be nice with clumps of grass. In 1 year, it took over the whole area, but luckily it's surrounded by concrete, so it couldn't go anywhere else. And the other stuff eked out a living, and I never had to weed it because nothing else could grow there hardly. So again, that spreading is, you have to think about it. And just breaking things down into phases. It can seem overwhelming. How am I going to do all this? And maybe you do the planning, and you get great big plans. Well, just pick one thing and start with that and make it bite-sized pieces. Site prep I'm not going to get into, but that is really important to get the right information depending on what you're dealing with, whether it's an old field or a lawn. You want to make sure that you properly get rid of any vegetation that's there that you don't want to be there anymore.
Could you address just quickly the newspaper and mulch?
So the newspaper and mulch is one of the ways that I've used at my house when I work with landscaping as a non-chemical way to kill existing lawn and other vegetation growing there. And you put down newspaper about 8 to 10 sheets thick, overlapped, because if you have a gap, you'll get weeds going through there. And then you put 3 inches of mulch over it. You don't want too much or too little, about the depth of 1 finger. And ideally, the best time to do that, if you do it in the fall, and then wait until spring and then plant come May, it works really well, but what you're doing is depriving those existing vegetation of light. When I work landscaping, we go back 3 or 4 weeks later and plant into it. So, but it works well. The 2 main local nurseries that we work with a lot, I'd be curious if there's others that people refer to in Wisconsin, but Leaning Pine, which is here in Superior, and Paul will be here later, and then Boreal Natives are the 2 main sellers of true native plants. And we have catalogs for Boreal, and we're hoping Paul will bring his other ones. And I think what I'm going to do for the sake of time is just mention real quickly that monarchs are on the decline. And we've joined in partnership with a whole bunch of other groups in what's called Monarch Watch. And as most people know, there's this monarchs migrate from Mexico or on the west coast, west of the Rocky Mountains to California, and back up to their summer grounds, which we're at the northern end of, but as you know, we get lots of monarchs here. But the trend is, overall, the population of monarchs is decreasing. And There's some threats in Mexico, such as logging, but also in the United States, the herbicide and pesticide use, and things like Roundup Ready crops that are having negative impacts. So one of the plants, common milkweed, you can get seed for, but swamp milkweed is what both the local native plant sellers sell, that if everybody added a 6-pack or 2 or 3 of these to their gardens, it smells good, it's beautiful, and it works for monarch attracting. Does anybody have milkweed in their yard? Do you get monarchs? Yeah, I mean, it's one of those almost guaranteed things. And in Douglas County, you can grow butterfly weed. It's too clayey in Duluth, but it likes, if you have the well-drained soils.
So, if I understand right, the swamp milkweed and your milkweed types, a lot of times they're hydric soil. So do they do okay up here?
They do the hydric soil, so where it's been wet a certain amount of the time of the year. And the word, that's a good point, because swamp milkweed implies that it prefers a wet area. I grow mine in a rain garden. I know people who grow it just on the edge of a rain garden in medium soils, but definitely not dry soils. But one thing in Duluth is the clay in so many yards is so shallow that it really does keep so that I think you get saturated soil on and off every rain event. So
what's the native milkweed? What is it? Is that what you said, milkweed?
right, so there's
butterfly weed. Okay, that was.
Yeah, 3 types in this area. So common milkweed, which is tricky to transplant. Once you get it, it spreads a lot. But to try to transplant it, I know people who have said if you dig it up in an area like the size of this rain garden with a lot of soil and slip that onto a piece of plywood or something and move it. But it doesn't, it's not like hosta or something where you can take just a little bit. It really needs, I don't know if it's because of the mycorrhizae or what, but it really likes to be, it's a little bit harder to transplant. But once you get it. So this is the swamp milkweed with the narrow leaves, and then the butterfly weed also. I was surprised that there is like 50, maybe it was 30, nationwide species of milkweed. So I think I want to wrap it up and move on to the next speaker, but what I will say, we have a lot of really great handouts on the Monarch program at the table that Kathy and I brought, so if people can stay around afterwards. There's one in particular, I'm going to grab it real quick. Well, okay, I'll just point. The one in the orange has steps and a lot of really detailed information on the Monarch Watch.
Plus lists
And
of
lists.
different recommended plants to attract.
For most things, I can just go talk to people about it. So that's the 20-minute wetland talk. Here's some contact information. Mine's up on the top left, Gary McNamara, that's me. But I also have some information for folks in the city who deal with stormwater projects, construction projects, landscaping projects, anything where you might be doing some grading, where you might be impacting stormwater. You want to be following some of these people. And then the folks locally that deal with wetlands from the agencies would be the Army Corps and the Wisconsin DNR, Bill Sandy and Steve Valley. Do you have any questions?
Where's the Corps of Engineers office?
Where is that?
Yeah.
It's in Spooner.
Oh, it's in Spooner?
Yeah.
To come up, if there's something up here, you have to come from Spooner?
The Army Corps does, yeah.